All right. How are we doing so far, everybody? We are now going to hear structured logging from Evan Phoenix. Evan Phoenix is the CEO and developer at Vectra, a startup building infrastructure tools and services. In addition, he's director at Ruby Central and maintains a number of Ruby projects, including Puma. He resides in Los Angeles with his wife Abby and 2 daughters. Thanks for sharing with us, Evan. I'm gonna duck off of the audio and video and let you run.
Sounds good. Let's do a quick test. Everybody hear me okay? We're gonna test that out here. Make sure the internet works. Okay. Great. Also, for some reason, it won't switch to the camera, so you guys get to look at my nice beard for the side of my face for a lot of this. So I'll face into the camera when need be. Yeah, thanks so much, Charles, for setting this up. I think that a couple of quick notes. I should have plenty of time for questions and stuff like that. And since we're sort of in a unique format, I would say go ahead and just type in the questions as they come along within the context of those slides. And as I kind of finish up a section, there's kind of like logical sections, I'll go and I'll kind of read through the questions and we'll answer them right there. That way it'll be a little more interactive, and I think it'll be potentially a more fun experience. So with that, let's get started. Today, Charles asked me to speak, and I thought for a while about what I wanted to talk about, and I could talk about a number of different things. And the thing I hit upon was actually, as this always happens, is the thing that I am actually doing, in my day-to-day work that has a lot of impact in Ruby as well as other languages that I thought would be really interesting to talk about, which is structured logging. Logs are sort of this kind of crufty idea. They're not fun usually. They're usually kind of a nuisance. I always thought I looked up log one day just to remind myself, why do we call them logs? And it's actually because of the log, because of an actual piece of wood. They used to keep to measure the how long, how quick or how fast a boat was going. They would throw a stick with a rope over, and then they would keep that in the log book because it was about the log. I always thought that was super interesting. Because we continue this, calling it a log, and sometimes I wish it was more fun. I wish it were actually log that we could be talking about, because everyone loves log. It's fun for girls and boys. But most of the time, our interaction with logs is this. It's a wall of text that, honestly, no one really has much of a good relationship with. I put it in there twice. The feelings about logs are usually like boring. You log all this stuff and you never really use it. It's annoying. It just takes up space and you don't use them. And they're usually opaque, like those walls of text. They're just random snippets from a programmer's brain. There's a classic log, which is this one from the Linux kernel, which is emitted in your system logs when your printer is having some random malfunctions. Indicates that your printer is on fire. Is a great example of a log that's just someone thought it was fun, it was interesting, and they just kind of put it in there. This particular log actually has a whole Wikipedia page attached to it if you want to go look it up. But they're that kind of thing. They're usually this just sort of heat noise off the top of a programmer's brain about what exactly is going on in this random scenario. And it feels a lot like let's just move the logs around. I generated them and I got to rotate them and delete them, and you don't really use them. And what you really want to be doing is making a lot better use of your log data, because it has a lot of invaluable things that you could be getting out of it. And most of the time, if you're just dumping in like I said, random snippets of text, you're probably not going to get a lot out of it. You're going to go back and look at them only under duress. So, structured logs is really what we really want to be moving towards, and we'll kind of get into what that is. I think it behooves us to ask an initial question, which is, why log at all? As we were working on, and I'll get into a little bit of this later, we've asked a lot of questions about like, why not just do this? Why not just say logs? I don't need logs. Let's just send them all to dev null. They're just a waste of space. They cause me to wake up in the middle of the night because the server filled up. The log partition with logs again, and what am I going to do, right? So let's just get rid of them. Well, usually there's about 5 different cases that you really want to keep your logs around for. And let's look at those for a second. The first one is exceptions. It's a classic logging case. Obviously you really want to know when things go really wrong is typically how you view these. And, for a lot of teams, this is how they drive what they should be fixing forward. It's just, what are my exception reports today? Let me go in and look at my email in the morning, and okay, I've got a lot of exceptions about this one weird bug. Let me go in and try and fix those. And clearly that's a good use for logs. Edge cases are another one. Putting logs on code that you're not sure if anyone uses this anymore. Another case is like, this shouldn't happen, but I'll log it if it does. By the way, if you do that, you get a gold star, because it's super common in code to just have a comment in the code that says, I should never get here. And if you're actually logging those cases so you can go back and figure out like if your assumption there is actually true, that is, you're already ahead of a lot of people. And the last one is like sort of type boundary checking. Somebody, I needed a this and somebody passed me a that over HTTP, and just logging those kind of edge cases that under your normal operations you're not going to see. And it also doesn't mean that like everything has gone wrong, but it's also good to know that like, maybe you have a client that's misbehaving, whatever it might be, that it's not a common scenario, but it's also not like the end of the world, like an exception, like I couldn't open this file or something like that. The third one is monitoring. You want to be able to track how your app is doing at a sort of a granular level, like, I had to reconnect to the database. Having those logs around, even just saying that you had to reconnect to the database, can be super useful when, in a week, say your database has problems and you want to say, I didn't even know that my app was reconnecting. How often have we been reconnecting? You want to go back and look at your logs, look at that. Query statistics, this query finished in this many milliseconds, that kind of thing, or memcache hits is another good example of that kind of thing that you want to log. Obviously, you don't want to get sometimes you don't want to get too crazy with logging that stuff. You don't want to obviously make it a bigger problem logging those things than they would have helped you solve in the first place, but they can be really useful to be able to log and to go back. And we can get into, if people want to talk about that, some techniques to sort of do inside the app, be able to do roll-ups. So if you really wanted to log like every memcache miss, you probably don't want to have an entry for every single one. You want to be able to sort of every 60 seconds emit a log entry. How many misses have been in the last 60 seconds? That kind of thing. Another one is analytics. So you're kind of getting into, when you do analytics, you get more into the business portion of your actual app. So you want to say like, okay, this user viewed this page, they just logged in. The last time they logged in was a year ago, or I can see by their cookie that they spent 30 minutes on the site before they bought anything. Those kinds of entries are super useful because you can go back and mine them for information later on. So you can say like, okay, well, what do I really want to, what are all the interesting things about my users? How are people using the site? Those are all good things that you want to be able to answer. And if you emit them into a log instead of, say, putting them in like an activity SQL table, you can easily manage them a lot better. You can roll them off, you can expire them. You know, what people did on your site 2 redesigns ago is probably not going to be useful data, and if you put that in a log file and you put that within your logging infrastructure, it could easily sort of roll off the end, which is great. And the last one is audits. And again, these are sort of related to analytics, but typically they represent more things that are important activities, like transactional activities that are going to happen on your site. Like I said, a user is created, a user bought an items, they added a credit card. Those are all, those logs are the kind of logs that when you have issues from users are invaluable. You want to go back and say, okay, they said that they had a problem on this page. Let me go back and see what they were doing on the site in order to get to that stage. And being able to rewalk someone's steps, of a user's steps, to be able to figure that out. That can be the difference between fixing the bug in 5 minutes and basically letting it languish for 6 months. Now, you know, we've talked a lot about just the idea of a log, just that there is data, and typically, sadly, they're usually just blobs of text. Like I said, they're just sort of heat noise off the top of the programmer's head. They don't necessarily represent anything consistent. In fact, even a single programmer working within a small code base, the logs that are emitted will be drastically different between even sections that were written, you know, just a few days apart. And the reason is that when there's no structure there, it just makes sense for whatever flow that programmer was in when they wrote that log message. So there might be some vague formatting. You don't really know what kind of data is in there. It's very difficult to be able to make use of those kinds of logs. Typically, even when people want to understand the logs, you have, you know, a human. Hopefully, a human wrote this log message. Hopefully, another human will understand it. Although that in itself is a very dicey proposition a lot of times. The log message that you decided to emit at 3 a.m. when you go and see it pop up in a log file a week later may make absolutely no sense to you anymore. So maybe you want to try to use something like regular expressions to try and pull data out of the entries, which can be okay. You can get data out of them, but you're not guaranteed that you're getting the right data. You have to spend a whole bunch of time writing those regular expressions, and for this reason, typically people don't even have these kinds of expressions for their own app data. They maybe will have something like, oh, let me go parse Nginx's log files. Because those things don't change, it's easy for me to write the regular expression one time. If I've got an evolving code base where I'm getting new log entries all the time, you're going to constantly be just working on random regular expressions that you're writing. So the third one you do a lot of times is you don't understand the logs. You just emit them, and you kind of hope that you won't ever have to use them. That's actually a sad but not uncommon strategy. So, structured logs, which is why we're all here this morning. I also should say, I forgot to say this at the beginning, like the first speaker, I feel like I should have set the tone by being on the beach or something like that instead of in my home office. When you think about structured logs, I think that it's important to make the first statement you need to make is that the logs are data. There are data that you should be using, that you could be using, and that if you're just emitting blobs of text, you're basically just wasting everyone's time. And if you are not using those logs, then you, like I said, it's just, yeah. I found this interesting. ThoughtWorks now says that structured logging is in the adopt phase, and they had a nice, very high-level definition for structured logging is a consistent predetermined message format containing semantic information. I think that the push for ThoughtWorks to say that it's in an adopt phase is also a very timely thing. And if you were here listening to the podcast previous, this fits right in with that. As we see the proliferation of services and service-oriented architectures and microservices and whatever it might be, the more you see that, the more pressure you will be putting on your logging service, because those operations that used to be, oh, let me just go send an email, let me just go do this other thing. Now another service is doing that. You need to track the boundaries between those two services. Did the other service get the request to send the email? Did this thing go in the queue? Whatever it might be. Those are all things that now you need to be logging. You need to be tracking those operations. You need to be able to find out when it goes wrong, when someone says, hey, I didn't get my email about my new order. You need to be able to go back and say, well, did the email system even get that order? Get that email to be sent? You need to be able to answer that question and not just assume that that was the case. You need to be able to know, oh, okay, here it is. I can see that it's there. And so the more services you have, the more boundaries you have, the more need that you're going to have to be able to log all those boundaries and be able to track the flow of an operation across services. As you move into services that are polyglot, the need is even greater. Because now, not only do you have disparate services running in different places doing different operations, but now they also have different languages. And so you may be able to, you're going to have to pass data that was formulated in language A to another service in language B. And if they're both emitting logs about what actually occurred within that operation, I sent this and I received this, if one uses a native closure logging blob syntax and the Ruby one uses just a text for Ruby, it's very difficult to correlate those things. And so you want to try and force as many of those services to be doing the logging in the same format as you can. And structured logging, adopting structured logging is the easiest way to do that. It's not go out and write a whole bunch of regular expressions and store them in a Git repo. So when you think about structured logging and you know that, okay, it's going to be some format. I want to have all my logs be in a particular format. You largely see two formats present out there in the wild. One is a really simple key value format. Incredibly easy to generate, easy for a human to read, relatively easy for a machine to read. The problem with this format, and I see it used plenty of places, is that you get into lots of sort of like SQL quoting problems, right? So yes, sure, account there is Evan, but let's say someone wants to say the account is an email address or a name, a full name, and there's a space in there. Again, we kind of get into where the simple key value breaks down because you add quoting and you add separators and all that kind of thing, and you get away from the simple aspect of that very quickly. And for that reason, people usually use this in very small places where it just makes sense, like, oh, I've got this tiny little thing I need to emit. But the minute that they have to add anything more, I almost always recommend that people move, just go straight to JSON. Start to emit your logs in JSON. It solves all those problems that the simple key value one does, quoting, typing, all separators, all that kind of stuff. And I mean, I think we all need to recognize that in 2015, it is effectively if not the universal format. There are tools in every language to emit JSON, to parse it, to read it. A human can read it. It's not the most human readable in the world, but it is certainly possible to look at it and to scan and to see what was actually going on here. And if you really want to read it better, it's outstandingly easy to go and write yourself some tools that will be able to read those logs in and emit them in a more human readable format, whether it's a web tool or just something on the command line that you're running to reformat the JSON to make it easier to read. That itself is very easy. Again, this is not a new idea. I didn't make this up. This is something that people have been talking about for years and years and years and years and years. There's a blog post from 2006, which is scarily almost a decade ago now, that talk about using JSON for logs. And we're seeing it start to get traction now in the last, probably 3 or 4 years, mostly because there's more services, people have recognized the need to have better logging, and the tooling around being able to manage those logs has just gotten a lot better in the last 3 or 4 years. I prefer JSON, and I think that most people should prefer doing it as JSON. And you really want to pick up a boring format for this. You don't really want to go out and say like, oh, let's write our own format that makes it nicer, or let's do this other thing. And the reason is that you're talking about data that likely will sit sort of just stagnant for a long period of time, and you're going to want to come back to it maybe and read it and parse it and understand it and correlate it with other data. And so the simpler format the simpler you make the format, the more likely are that you're going to be able to recover and use that data in the future. And so because it's simple and it doesn't have all of the bells and whistles, it makes it a little more future-proof, if you will. And this is a place to pick something boring. Don't go out and innovate. Now, if you find yourself in a situation where like JSON isn't going to fit my needs for whatever reason, I really do need a custom format. Generally don't. But if you've already gone down this road and you feel like, okay, this is something that I really need based off of whatever needs, you've got some logging that requires very specific types that you don't feel are representable in JSON for whatever reason, layer them on top of another kind of format or another kind of tool. If you really need to have the logs being emitted in, like, say, protocol buffers, that's a good answer. If it really feels like it needs to be super compact, you can use message pack, which is sort of like a binary JSON, although that one is even sort of hopefully compressing your logs, so the space savings is kind of a moot point there. But generally, stick to the simplest kind of format. You're better off having some kind of JSON schema that you have to go through and parse out than trying to say like, oh, I want to emit this thing in protocol buffers. Again, really understand, have a good reason to do it. But if it's a text format, just use JSON. So you kind of get this idea that now your logs are this data. So let's look at a couple of sort of quick examples of what this would look like. So let's say you have some operational data, we're now calling it. This is perhaps emitted by Nginx. This is a get, and this was the path, and here were the headers, and now you've got this thing that's easy to look at, easy to go in and find out some information about. I can easily write some, and we'll get into this a little bit later, I can usually write and use tools to be able to extract all of the things for a particular request ID. Now, I could have done that with grep, but it's much easier to do it with the tools where it's already formatted. And that's the whole point that we're trying to get to here. But then you also get things that can also sit alongside. I mean, these are complementary pieces of data. They can be emitted inside the exact same file because each entry is sort of self-contained. So you can say, okay, here's maybe some business, some analytics. In this particular case, it's that there was someone, I signed up for some site at plaidshirts.com, and I used this TV code because I was watching in the middle of the night. I needed a plaid shirt, right? Now you've got all this great business analytics information that when you want to answer the question, how many people use that TV code, you can easily go back and answer that question. And now you've got an audit log also. This can form an audit log of who signed up when. So you've decided I'm in. I'm all in on structured logging. I totally get it. I want to embed all my logs in JSON. I want to feel the power of having all of this data unlocked, if you will. So you get into this next phase, which is, what exactly do I log, though? And this question is very important to consider. The answers that you have amongst your team will govern a lot of how well you can use that data. So there's generally 3 sort of pieces that you want to consider as you're working on answering this question. The first one is the who. Every entry needs to answer, who is this entry about? And the typical way of doing that is just with a key called event. And I did that on the previous ones as well. And you want to have some kind of simple identifier, user add, request sent, whatever it might be. Some people prefer to actually have a short message here instead of just a sort of a underscored single identifier. If you do that, try and keep your messages really short. I really prefer doing identifiers. They're much easier to search for. You, as an organization, you can build a dictionary of these identifiers. So you can actually say, here's all of our different kinds of events that are in our system. And you don't even have to be that formal about your actual usage. You can just come up with a semantics. So in this particular case I've talked about, you could easily just say, I'm going to have a noun verb format for all of my identifiers. So user add, user delete, whatever it might be. And now I can even go through and I can, as I'm searching, I can say, what are all the user actions that occurred on this particular user? And I can just say, search for user underscore inside the event, and I can get all of those, not just the one. And that, again, huge for auditing, being able to understand what someone's doing on your site. And obviously you can derive new identifiers that way very easily. If you do that, obviously the dictionary becomes much smaller. You generally need to document what your nouns are, or what your nouns are, and then roughly what your verbs are. The next thing you want to do is, you've identified the who. The next thing you want to do is the where. And this is sort of the context that this log message is emitted inside. The idea is to try and scope that event to something that makes sense that you can actually search off of. It is details that are not necessarily the value about this log message. It is something that will give you search context to be able to look into it. So here's a good example of some where. So in this particular case, this is an event, user add to cart. So I added some item to a cart somewhere. And in this particular case, I've used tags, and we'll get into that in a sec, to indicate, the host, the actual web server this occurred on, and the user ID that it occurred on, right? There's not a lot of common ways. People do use tags for this. I prefer tags. Some people do @tags. Some people don't use this at all. I suggest you do use it. There's a lot of value in there because it's easy to say. You can go through and I can say, I want to know all of the events of user add to cart where tags.user ID is this particular user, right? And that can be super, super easy. So the where is, some other context examples that you might have is the server that it occurred on, we included that, the user that performed the operation, and also maybe a component that emitted it. So maybe you're inside the subscription emailer. You might include that as some tag data. Again, you want to be able to go back through and say, show me all of the log entries from the subscription emailer. Does that make sense? I got a quick question here. Phil asks, why would you have put user ID in the tags but not item ID? Oh, that's a super good question. So let's go back to it real fast. Whoa, this scroll is super sensitive. Okay. So the reason that and again, this is more of a philosophical thing. It's less of a very hard rule. It's something that you have to kind of just, as you kind of work with it, you kind of have to get a good feel for it. The reason in this particular case is because the operation was add to cart. And so the values, the actual things that are being added in this particular case were the item ID and the quantity ID. So that's because I'm adding things to a cart. So I'm adding things to whose cart? This particular user ID. So that's why I opted to put the user ID into tags in that particular case, right? So you can think of, if you think of this operation being emitted, it's you're adding something to a cart. How many of what thing? That's the actual the what, which we'll get into in a sec. And then the who and the where are, in this particular case, the where is the user ID that you actually was adding it to the cart for. Again, it's a subtle thing. It's something that, and obviously, there's lots of teams that don't use tags at all. They put everything inside the main body. They just say it's all values. This is sort of just a personal thing. Separating them out has some power as you kind of go forward in just trying to manage the data load. Don't forget that as you kind of get into this and do more structured logging, you will get more and more and more and more and more and more of these things. So I'll give you an example of where keeping them separate can be nice. Let's say I'm running a social network, and my event might be user add friend. In that particular case, my tag's user ID might be the person that is actually adding the friend. And then I have inside the body another user ID that represents the actual friend, right? So in that particular case, the user ID is what is the data item. But there's two distinct ones. There's the context that it's occurring in, and there's the one that's the actual value of being the friend, right? Does that make sense, Phil? Somewhat. I mean, I agree. This is a very nuanced argument that I'm making here, and I think that the main part is to not just. I mean, you can take it or leave it on this particular point. I think that if you're already in on doing structured logging, I think that's the meat of it, if you will. I would say, yeah, and we'll get into a little bit. Like, for example, if I logged business object ID updated, I would include as a tag since it's the ternary. I agree, and we'll get into a little bit later on with sort of what we call field dictionaries about how you actually want to be able to use those kinds of things. I don't disagree with you there. This becomes just sort of a how does it feel to the team, right? Obviously, like in the case of host web 1, I think we can both agree that obviously is a piece of tag data. You're not going to you wouldn't include that in the value, right? Okay. So again, there's nuance here. There's nuance. It's technology, after all. So get into the what, which we've been talking about for a little bit here. The what is sort of the meat of your log. It's all of those attributes. Now, as we kind of were getting into it, as we're talking with Phil's question, it feels like it's just a free form, like it's just I can log a whole bunch of data. That's amazing. Just hold your horses. Remember that the whole point of this is that you're trying to enforce some kind of order onto your logs. And if you just go hog wild and just have it be completely free form, you will have data, but it won't necessarily. It'll be better than blobs, but it won't necessarily fulfill what you need in terms of long-term usage. So doing a little bit of coordinating beforehand will go a long ways as you're rolling out structured logging, or if you're already using it, just kind of cleaning it up. Let me give you sort of two quick examples of why this is the case. These are examples I've seen in the wild. App 1 is going to emit some structured logging that looks like this, and App 2 is going to emit some that looks like this. Now, to those programmers that did this made total sense. Of course, App 1, the context maybe is the login, and so I've got the email address and that's their username, perhaps, and so it made sense for me to log the information just as the email address. And App 2 is maybe just sent a user ID to go use, and so it's going to say, well, I want to log the user. I'm just going to go ahead and emit the ID, right? And another case is App 1 maybe is seeing that, like, okay, I got a request from this IP. Great, let me log that so that we can use it later. And App 2, again, a different programmer, maybe on the same team, is going to say, oh, I've got another IP address from something else. I'm going to go ahead and emit it. And obviously, we see two distinct problems in both of these examples. And the way that you can kind of actually separate them, yeah. So this first one, obviously, the problem is that they've sort of overloaded it. Like, what is user? What is a valid value for user? In this particular case, there's just not agreement upon how I should label an IP address, right? And these are little things. They're not huge things. They don't require a committee and a long discussion to answer. But if you answer them up front, you just save yourself all of the grief down the road. So what I suggest is that you kind of establish a field dictionary. What are those keys going to mean? What are those keys actually are there? And I put together a quick one that I pulled from another project called the Common Event Emitter project that has a whole bunch of common sort of keys and types, and then descriptions about what they mean. And it's effectively the same as some kind of style guide. that you would go through and you would say, okay, if whenever we have an IP address, call it IP. Whenever we have a user, call it user email, whatever it might be. The other thing you can do is just use some simple conventions, right? So you can use suffixes. Really easy. We're all in Rubyland. We're very used to this from working inside Active Record. Use an _ID suffix on something where it will always be that kind of an integer that represents something, a database ID, right? And try to keep the field dictionary up to date as you can, right? So if you're going through and you're adding a whole bunch of things, a whole bunch of keys, concepts, if you keep it up to date and you use it and you review it, it doesn't require a lot of time, but it will save everyone a whole bunch of grief if you can kind of coalesce on the same 90% of the keys that you're using. So, timestamps. There's not much to say here other than just don't get fancy. Have a key named timestamp, keep it in ISO. I don't think that's the right ISO number. I think I forgot a 1. The JSON, yeah. But have that timestamp. Have it on every single message. Don't leave it off because you're like, oh, this happened right after the other one. They will get reordered. You will see them in isolation. You want them to be standalone. Include a timestamp on every single message. Quick note about timestamp generation. Run NTP on every machine. Use UTC everywhere. And we'll get into what I mean by favoring emitting durations and intervals. On the NTP note, I went into a machine that I just booted on AWS just 4 days ago, and it is already drift 5.3 seconds because I forgot to set up NTP on it, right? So this is, some people think on cloud servers that the actual timekeeping is actually held elsewhere, that the hypervisor will do it. It will not, and the skew is extremely bad because of the hypervisors clocking VMs in and out. So run NTP on every single machine, no matter what it is. Use UTC. This is not rocket science. Most people already do this for dealing with when you're dealing with a database. Time zones obviously only confuse the matter. If you want extra credit, I tweeted about this last night. Look into using TAI64N. It is a time representation that is absolute. It's not tied to the actual rotation of the Earth as with leap seconds and all that kind of business are. It's got nanosecond precision, and because of it not having leap second issues, which you all are dealing with right now because we're about to introduce a leap second in a week, you won't know that, like, for instance, these two events that were emitted right on June 30th, that one looks like it came before the other, but it actually came after it because of the leap second. That is definitely going to happen in every single one of your logs. You will be confused because of that in those logs that looks like these events that should be AB look like BA. It's going to happen. And lastly on this, before I look at the questions, is durations and intervals. And by this I just mean that if you're emitting anything that is clock relative, emit the actual clock relative value. So if you're going to do some time, if you're going to do time measurements, emit the measurement, not the actual timestamps. And just save yourself the grief of having to calculate it again after the fact, right? It just makes everything that much easier. And obviously they're immune to being misreading, and they're totally stable because they're two relative values. Oh yes. Okay, so questions. Let's see here. Simon says we also add, I think that's thread ID when we run multi-threaded. Absolutely. So I didn't include that, but if you're doing a lot of multi-threaded operations, you want to, that emitting a thread ID can be super useful. And I'll actually get into a little bit later on in the next slides right now about other things that you could emit that make sense, that make a little more sense than thread ID. Thread ID is totally useful though. And let's see, Jackie D says for leap seconds, Google uses the leap smear. Yeah, smear. I think AWS is going to do the smearing too over a day. Basically, the smear is that for the 24-hour period up to then, they will elongate the entire 24-hour period by a fraction of a second, so that the last leap second is actually absorbed throughout the entire day instead of seen at the very end. So again, for this exact reason, that it causes lots of headache. But if you go off and you just use TAI 64 or TAI in general, you don't have this problem. And then you can always convert to UTC later on. So we're all in, right? Everybody's in. Structure is better than blobs. You're going to go off and convert all your things. But how do we do that? So let's get into the Ruby specific stuff that you want to do this actually in Ruby now. Don't worry, Doug, I got you covered. So there's a couple of really easy ways to do this. Rails has a log rage gem. You can drop it in. It's got really great instructions, and it will convert all of the Rails logs to structured logs, including all of the partials, renderings, all of it. It's great. You can just drop that in, and you can get structured logs just going forward right now. If you're doing a 12-factor app, you're logging the output. You don't really even need a gem. In fact, I recommend that you just kind of roll it on your own within your own infrastructure. You just emit JSON to standard out or standard error, depending on how you're logging. It's really super easy to integrate. You can have an event. You can have a method or two that sets some defaults based off what you're doing, and you can go. It doesn't. This is one nice thing about this concept is that it doesn't need a lot of infrastructure. You don't have to go off and write a whole bunch of things in order to do it well. And if you're using the built-in Ruby's logger, that's okay. Still just send the message as JSON. It's better to have some structure in there than none, and you can use a combination of tools to extract that structure and then be able to have pure structured logs later on. Yeah. Not exactly Ruby, but certainly within the typical Rails stack, and I've dumped one in there, an example, is you can change Nginx to emit all of its logs in JSON, and then you can correlate them much easier with your Ruby logs, and you can see what all your assets were. You can see what user requested what assets based off cookie values, and that can be great. So it's some easy ways to get in there. Now we're kind of into, again, the more implementation side of what do I log. And there's a couple of things in here that I think are really important, that as you're emitting those logs, what do I want to include actually in my logs as tags or as values, depending on if you're me or if you're Phil. The X request ID that comes in from HTTP, again, this is assuming an HTTP app. Heroku generates one by default. You can generate one. Nginx, there's a module to generate them. And if you don't have it at all, you can actually just generate it at the top, as a rack middleware. It's just some X request ID. And the idea there is that it's just some unique thing, and you're going to go ahead and include it as inside the where of all the requests. And this will allow you to know all of the events that happen in the context of a single request, and that is huge. Because as you kind of get into more structured logs and you start logging a lot of other times in other places, you want to be able to say, what are all the things that happened for this request during this one single request? And just answering that question is enormous, right? You can also get into things like if you have session IDs, you include a session ID as well right there. Moving on to not necessarily strictly HTTP related apps, a transaction ID. So let's say that you're doing something where you are updating MySQL or Postgres and Redis, and you're going to write a thing into Memcache, and you want to go ahead and include some logs about that those things all occurred. When you do that, generate a random ID before you start doing all that work, and then include that random ID on the log messages about the work being done. And that way you can go back easily and say, let me go look at all the log messages that occurred that were grouped together within this single transaction. That just makes those logs even usable. Whereas previously you would see, like some random memcache miss message and not know what the context for that was. Now you can know that it's actually the context of, oh, look, Redis was down, and then I missed again, and then I got this other thing. So and you're obviously combining this with the previous ones as well. You've got the request ID in there as well. So now you're able to see a request ID that has multiple transactions, that some of them are failing and some of them are not. The third one is similar to transaction ID, but I actually think of it as a separate concept. And this is, I'm just going to take a super, actually I'll get to that in a sec. So this is the idea of an operation ID. So when you're writing, you're working with a bunch of services, or even not, you have some kind of operation that you're doing, and typically people would see it as the request ID would actually the serve this purpose. I like to have a separate one called the operation ID, that what I do is before I go off to do something, before I go off to write some directives in the database and talk to another service and do this, that, and the other thing, I generate an operation ID and I include that in all the logs and I forward it on to any service that I'm going to talk to so that it can log that operation ID in there as well. And so now you get this ability to say a single operation that is maybe spread throughout a number of different services, and maybe even included a background task that was queued up that pops in later on. You can actually correlate them all back together and see all the logs that were for a single operation. And again, it's very easy to do this. You generate a random ID, you pass it around, you forward it on to other services, and now you can easily correlate all those things back together as a single operation, if you will. That's what operation ID. Real quick, Phil says that there's that TIA64N library in Ruby. I went and looked at it last night. It has a really ugly bug that if you start using it now and then you really want to use it again in 2 weeks after we get another leap second, it's going to be a second off. It doesn't have any leap second calculation built into it. So that's why I was saying like maybe I need to start my own TIA64N Ruby library and actually have it contain a proper time second with leap second database. So yeah. Oh no, it's fine. I did the exact same thing, and I was like, I wonder if they handle leap seconds properly, and it doesn't. So just FYI there. But Phil gets a gold star for doing his extra credit. So we're kind of winding up here. So you've got all these logs. That's amazing. Congratulations on doing structured logging. Be sure to take Friday off because you've earned it. And now it's Tuesday of the next week, and you actually want to use those logs. So how are you going to make use of them? Right. So there's a couple of good tools out there that we're going to go over. The first one is effectively indispensable when you're doing JSON logs, and it is the JQ tool. It's in Homebrew. It's in apt. It is in Yum. It is in Shebangabang, whatever the latest Linux package manager is, I'm sure. It's all in there. And it has a query syntax for parsing and being able to do expressions on JSON. And it is way more powerful than I can even show. You could do an entire presentation, hour presentation on all the JQ features. It's got a whole syntax, a query syntax, so it's great. This particular one is just an example of I just wanted to see all of the log, all the entries where the request IP was this particular thing. Another common one that people use is the ELK stack, which is an open source stack for doing logs. E for Elasticsearch, L for Logstash, K for Kibana. Logstash is totally on board with all of the stuff that I have detailed here. Logstash has a format, a log format that it has that if you send it data in its format, it will do it fine. And all the rules I've given here are the same rules that Logstash has. I paused for a second there because I can't remember if they dropped the @ on timestamp or not, but I'm pretty sure that he did. So we'll accept random, just JSON, and then it will log it to Elasticsearch, and you'll be able to go back and search and do all that kind of fun stuff on it. Tons of teams use this. It's a real powerful tool. There's existing SASs out there that do this. Log entries and Logly will both parse JSON logs. The service that we're working on at Vectra is also a logging SAS that parses JSON logs, and we're working on the beta right now, so it should be out in the next few weeks. If anybody who's out there wants to get on that beta, you can drop me a line, and we'll discuss it. Kind of boring, but also super useful for dealing with JSON logs is just S3. It's just, as you go and you download those logs, and rather than just delete them off of your servers, send them up to S3. S3 is incredibly cheap for just keeping that kind of data around, and you very well may need to correlate something that maybe happened a couple weeks ago, especially if it's some kind of like business audit logs. So one nice thing that you can also do, if you're using S3 and you want to keep more different kinds of logs, is you can use a MapReduce or a tool or whatever. You can use JQ to process your logs and remove, say, the Nginx logs, and you just want to keep the business analytics or the business audit logs around, and then you can send those back up to S3 and keep them stored up there. Obviously, S3 could be any object store. Just having them and keeping them around will do you a favor. You'll be able to answer questions that you normally wouldn't be able to answer, because that has to do with log data that is, potentially a couple weeks old. If you have a large infrastructure, you're rotating your log files, every day. You probably only have at most a week's worth of actual logs before you just go ahead and delete them. So keeping them around for an extra couple months for almost no cost could be huge if you're trying to correlate something or answer some question about some long-term data, some long-term analytics that you don't have the data for yet. So your logs are your data, and I think it's high time that we all start treating them that way. So that's it. That's the talk. I have some more sort of gotcha slides at the end here. I've only got like 4 minutes, so I probably won't get to them unless people really want to see them. They're related to like don't use UDP and stuff like that. So do we have any other questions?
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and turn on Q&A mode. You'll see a little pop-up come up. So you can ask a question, and then once you click it, you'll have to enable your microphone, and then you can ask Evan your question.
Cool.
Or you can just type it in chat, and I'll say it at him.
That's great.
So Doug says logs seem to compare nicely to having backups. There are a number of nice comparisons there.
Yeah, I mean, if you have, if you do a lot of, if you really buy in on this concept and you start to do a lot of analytics or audits, you can reconstruct your data from your logs. If you were doing stuff like, if you log every time a user is created and for some reason you lost a database and you don't have all the new users from the last day, you can go and look at your logs and recreate those users again from the logs. So, and that is actually how databases work. Most databases keep a write-ahead log that will contain the data that the operations that would have occurred, and then so you can sort of make your own database that way.
All right. The next question is, how do you pass things like operation IDs into, say, Nginx, for example?
Sure. So, what you're going to have to do in those particular cases is think about the thing that's behind Nginx rather than Nginx itself. Obviously, if you're passing it, you're doing a REST API between two Ruby apps, you could just set a header. Just come up with some convention for what your header is. I actually usually like people to use a header that's specific to their org. So, like at Living Social, we use like an X-LS header that or prefix on our headers. So you can just pass a header through. You need to do that, edit or change your REST calls to be able to include that header. But that's usually pretty easy.
Avdi asks, are semantic logs a gateway drug to event sourcing architecture?
There are so many buzzwords in there. I feel like I need another cup of coffee before I can answer that question. Probably. I don't see why not. I mean, I think that if you really buy in on logs, on doing structured logging, you start to do everything with them. So you start to basically emit everything as events. You start to feel like you want to keep a copy of every operation that occurred and be able to know what happened last week, and you want to be able to regenerate your entire data set from the logs. It's not uncommon for people to for it to go to their heads. I wouldn't go that far to start, but that certainly is an option as you start to get more comfortable.
All right, Anthony asks, are there any good techniques or tools for filtering logs in real time?
It's funny because that's one thing that like the SaaSes try to handle. There are some tools that I've used that are separate tools than the log storing that are really just for log tailing. There are not great ones to give you an honest answer yet cheaply. Exactly. I mean, it's a hard answer. The answer is usually, I guess, the reason that you don't see a lot of tools around real-time tailing, which is what we're talking about, is the volume. When you get the usefulness at volume is very low. So if I'm getting get a meg per minute, a meg every 5 seconds worth of logs, and I'm actively filtering them as they come through. Unless my filter is extremely specific, the actual view, the thing that I'm actually viewing, is not super useful because it just is scrolling by as a wall of text. And if I'm trying to just let it wash over me, unless I'm operator in the matrix, I don't know how I'm actually using that data. So you don't see a lot of tools built around that.
All right, well, our time's up. I built a half-hour break into the conference between now and the next talk, which is Michelle Totolo talking about APIs. So if you want to stick around and chat, then feel free to do it. If you want Evan to show his gotchas, we can do that for a minute. And, just kind of water cooler it or go get another slice of pizza or something. And then we'll come back and hear from Michelle. But thanks, Evan. Thank you so much for talking to us.
My pleasure. Do you want to see those gotcha slides, people of the internet? People typing furiously. Okay.
There are a few guesses, so go ahead.
Does it matter?
What was that?
Never mind. Okay, so my gotcha slides were volume. So as you start to generate those structured logs, one thing that you kind of get into is the structured logs have more data in them than the blobs would, almost by design, really. And so you're going to put a lot more pressure on your actual disks and on your logging infrastructure to make sure that you're actually rotating your logs properly and that you're compressing them. When you roll this out for the first time, you're going to want to review your log rotation frequencies, a few hours after you do it, and the next day, and make sure that they make sense again. So, maybe you were saying, oh, we only need to rotate and delete old logs every day, but now you're generating twice as much. You might accidentally fill up your drive, and you need to be deleting and rotating them every 6 hours or something like that. So that's something to really watch out for as you kind of go forth into the world of structured logging. UDP logging, just don't do it. If you really want to log over UDP, just don't send them at all. It's basically the same as sending them in the first place. They get lost. They don't represent any kind of meaningful data. You might get one, and you might not get another one, and then you try and figure out how they're not how could this operation happen without the one before it happening, and you just cause yourself a huge amount of problems doing logs over UDP. It's one of syslog's biggest missteps, in my opinion. And the last quick gotcha is syslog, TCP syslog. Certainly better than UDP, but there are problems with TCP syslog. If you're logging across with a decent latency, so if it's not like to the syslog server that's right there, you can have problems related to if the TCP session shuts down, the client will just keep sending logs through, and if the server never gets them, they're lost. They get wiped from buffers, and you don't have any way to recover them. And that's just because syslog TCP doesn't do any kind of acknowledgments about the actual data. So it's just a hose that goes one direction, and if one side closes the hose, then anything that was in the hose while you sent it, it gets lost. So just something to watch out for. A lot of people will do a local syslog server that's also sending them to disk before sending them like to a SAS or to wherever else they're sending them, just so that they have another copy as well. That's another way to do it. So those are my only quick gotchas. I guess if we have a half an hour break, do we have any last questions? Otherwise, I will send you off on your merry way.
All right, I see some thanks is coming in, so I think we're good.
Okay.
Thanks again, Evan.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, guys.
You just created a whole bunch more work I got to go do on my stuff now for the logging. All right, well, we will be back in 25 minutes to hear from Michelle. So in the meantime, feel free to chat, grab some food, get comfortable in your chair, whatever you're doing, and we'll be back in, like I said, 25 minutes.